Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know many of you work today in your secular work, and that makes for a late evening. By the time we get home, get settled in, some of you in school, and just appreciate you being out here tonight. It says something about your faith and about your desire to learn more about the Word of God. Tonight, I realize that a sermon doesn't have to be eternal to be immortal. I'll try not to make it eternal. But actually, we have two topics that we're talking about tonight. And I'm assuming my PowerPoint's coming up. I want to talk about the subject of anxiety and depression tonight. The two subjects, actually, what could be two lessons very easily. When I talk with people about pornography, about addiction, about cyber sexual or cyber relations and so forth, when I talk with them about that, usually what comes up by the time we're done is things that travel with pornography and with various addictions, and that is anxiety and depression. There are three things that people generally, and as I said before, I deal exclusively with members of the church, conservative members of the church from around the country and some from across seas. And the top three topics that we talk about, or top four: pornography, betrayal, which we'll cover tomorrow night, anxiety, and depression. And these fill my schedule. Now, there are other things that come in, but anxiety and depression among God's people is pretty rampant. And so I want to talk with you tonight about this subject. Am I on? I'm not on. I am on. There we go. All right. Well, this poor lady's depressed. You ever felt that way? Ever gotten depressed? Depressed moods are part of life. A person that doesn't have depression sometime doesn't really have a life. A person that doesn't have excitement sometime doesn't have much of a life. We're not made to be flatline. And so we will have our ups and downs in life. But in this lesson, what we're talking about is extremes. And I want to just look and jump in immediately into Bible characters who showed signs of depression. Now, I don't know that I would say that all these people are clinically depressed, but I would say that there's characters in the Bible that certainly had some of the symptoms of depression, if not all of them. One of them had almost all of them. Cain was one of those. His concern was, and his depression was created by guilt. He lived in fear, anxiety, that because he had killed his brother Abel, that the whole world was going to come after him. And so he was going to have to look over his back, look over his shoulder. And God said, I'll put a sign upon you that that people won't be bothering you. And so that's how God dealt with that. But the cause of Cain's depression was his guilt. And guilt is one of the main things that feeds depression. We look at other Bible characters. I look at a man named Moses. And I'm looking at a man named Moses. And Moses was depressed about life's circumstances. In Numbers 11, 16 through 14, or 10 through 16, Moses was concerned because that our soul just loathes this light bread that is out here. Did you bring us out here? We're wandering in the wilderness. Life situations had gotten boring for him. And he was wondering, how much longer we got to put up with this? Routine things and circumstances around us can make us bored, and boredom can lead to depression, as in the case with Moses. I'm not going to read all these verses. I'm going to leave those for you to read later. I will summarize most of these for sake of time. Another person that was depressed was a man named Jonah. And Jonah shows signs of depression along with anger. And what I learned from Jonah is what depression is. Depression is anger turned inward. He turned that anger, and then finally he released that anger by going out sitting under a gourd, and he got so mad he passed out. You ever been that mad? Well, that was Jonah. Jonah's problem was he was fighting with God, and that led to his depression and to him withdrawing, and basically he was just walking around mad all the time. Did you ever get a good mad on and not know what to do with that anger? That anger doesn't go away. And when we swallow that anger down inside, that anger will result either in rage, that's acting out, or result in depression, which is acting in. Depression has three things that travel with it: regret, resentment, and retaliation. And those three things follow with depression, and they churn inside of an individual: regret, resentment, and retaliation. And they churn inside of an individual, longing for an outlet, and either we take it out on ourselves, on those that are around us, we demonstrate it in our mood, and I believe Jonah certainly did that, and is a case in the Bible of a man that was depressed, and he handled his depression in some pretty strange ways. Now, what we know in Jonah's case is that God was around too, and that God had a challenge for Jonah, and Jonah didn't want to meet God's challenge. He didn't want to live like God wanted. He didn't want to do what God wanted him to do. So he was not willing to step up, man up, and do what God wanted. He wanted to second guess God. And that certainly we look at him as an example of things that cause depression and things that feed depression. Primarily his anger was prolonged. And that's a whole nother story. Probably the most clinical case of depression in the Bible is a man named Elijah. You recall 1 Kings chapter 18, where Elijah meets with the prophets of the Balaam and the Ashereth there on Mount Carmel, and there he demonstrates the superiority of God over all false religion. And in chapter 19, where would you expect to find this man who had triumphed and led God's people in victory? I would expect to see him going on to the next phase. But instead, in 1 Kings 19, what we see is a man who is depressed. That is, that he goes out, he's concerned because Ahab and Jezebel has sworn out that she will kill him by that time tomorrow. That's nothing new. As you read Elijah's story up to this time, there was already that consequence on him. And but this time it made a difference. And so he is fearful. Fear can drive anxiety, and certainly did in Elijah's case. And we see Elijah also being exhausted. Exhaustion can drive depression. That's part of what put him into this phase where he was physically worn out. Now we have our brethren today that many of us burn the candle at both ends. We don't realize that just like it took God 6 days to work and 1 day to rest, we take the day of rest and we make it a day of work, and we go seven days a week, full blast. And then if somebody asks us to do something, we add on to the schedule and we walk around exhausted. Often that takes its role in terms of being sleep deprived, because what often we'll give is our time that we need to rest, to refresh, and our bodies are made, as we're fearfully and wonderfully made, we're made that there's a time that we need to recharge. But many people bypass that, and then in their exhaustion, it gives birth to depression and all the thoughts that are churning around, things that need to be resolved, a lot of unfinished business that goes in our head, and often that gets processed in troubled dreams. It gets processed in moods, processed in various ways. Men tend to, when they get that way, depressed men tend to want to add more to their workload. And so they get a lot busier. They add things that just keep them more occupied. And women, on the other hand, and not always, this isn't an exact thing, but women often will kind of go into a neutral cycle where they kind of sit and ruminate, or they ruminate about a thing, they dwell on it, and they overfeed themselves and work themselves sometimes into a deeper depression. Elijah had a major problem, and his problem was he was trying to mind God's business. Now here he is, God gives him nourishment, God supplied his needs, and God asked him, "What's wrong with you?" And the message was, "I'm the only one, I've lived for you, and I'm the only one left that's trying to do right." Now, does that sound like a pity party? That's part of depression. And actually, it's not true. Because as you read a little earlier, there were some prophets hidden in a cave. One of those was the prophet Obadiah, who was a faithful prophet. And Elijah knew that because he helped to hide him and to feed him. He knew that. But somehow he got tunnel vision. That goes with depression. And the tunnel vision led him to think, "I'm the only one left." Well, what did God do about that? Here's what God did. God said, "Elijah, you sit under this tree and feel sorry for yourself, and you sit there for a couple thousand years, and I'm going to have a little purple pill that you can take, and it's be called an antidepressant. You take that, and you'll be fine." Is that what your Bible says? God's remedy for depression was the first thing that you need to do, Elijah, is to get your thinking straight. You're not a very good accountant. I have several thousand who have not bowed their knee to Baal. You're not the only one. And I can accomplish my purpose through other people besides you. It's not all about you. That was the first thing God did, is got his thinking straight. And the second thing God did, he said, "You know what? You've been doing what you've been doing long enough. I've got some new things for you to do. There's a new direction. There's new challenges. I want you to go start a school for the prophets. I want you to go anoint 2 kings. And that's the challenge. Now, he hadn't done that before, but that was his new challenge. Sometimes we get so burnt out and we do the same thing over and over and over, and the door is closed on that part of our life, but we insist on staying in that part of our life when actually God has plans for us to move on. I worked down the road here. I was transferred to Indianapolis to be in the corporate office, and pretty good job. And we sat around the table. There were 60 managers sitting around the table. And the service demand was not as strong as the dollars that went out. And so we sat asking the question, what do we need to do so that we can balance this budget? And some of those managers said, well, we just need to reduce the workforce, which meant the earners. And I spoke up and said, that's not what we need to do. We have 60 people in this room that are pretty high-paid people, and the cuts need to come from this room. I realized when I said that I would be one of those, and so would the medical director. We were all the newbies. The last ones in need to be the first ones out, and we cut that budget. And I had to go on and find a different job. Sometimes, and when I went out that evening, I was asked the question, because I like to think I can hide things and people can't read me. So I was asked the question, what's wrong? And typically, nothing, I'll be all right. And I was hounded. It's like something's wrong. Finally, she got it out of me. Well, today I voted to lose my job. Now, her response made me angry because she was right. Did you ever have a woman that was right, but it made you mad that she was right? And she said, good. You didn't like that job anyway. Well, that was true. And she said, you didn't have the courage to close the door, so God closed it for you. And he's got something else in mind for you, and you need not to sit and feel sorry for yourself. You need to find out what God's got that's next. And God had a plan for me to go to downtown Indianapolis and work with homeless people. And I did that for about 12 years. One of the most rewarding things I've ever done is to help those who were formerly homeless to obtain housing and then to help them behave so they could stay in their housing. Very rewarding job. And that led me to what I'm doing today. You see, when God closes the door, it's not over. He's got something else in mind for you. And while we don't know the future, we know the one that holds the future. Right? Well, Elijah had to learn that. Yes? Start a school. Teach the prophets. And by the way, one of your students is going to be a greater prophet than you. Because you're going to teach him what you know, and he's going to put that with what he knows, and he'll know a lot more than you know because he knows what he knows. And that's exactly what happened. And so Elisha became the protege of Elijah. Sometimes we have to go to the valley of despair for God to wake us up and to realize that we're not in charge, God is. Elijah was such a man. David was another man that shows signs of depression. David, we see his depression caused by his guilt. Now in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 10 and the verses following, we read that passage, and what it tells us is that David was sore depressed after what he did in sinning with Bathsheba. And his soul was troubled. But the trouble that came to him was he was guilty of sin. Now David wasn't willing to shed that sin. He wanted to sit on it. And he sat on that sin for quite a while until the prophet Nathan comes to him some months later and tells him a story. And David, find it interesting that people can solve other folks' problems, but they can't solve their own? Well, David saw right through what was going on with that guy that killed a guy's sheep and served it for dinner. David saw right through that, and his pronouncement was, that man's worthy of death. And Nathan said, thou art the man. Sometimes when we look at if other people are doing the thing we're doing, we can see very clearly what's wrong with that. But something happens to our vision, and we don't see that actually, thou art the man. This is about you. There was a fellow who was sitting in the audience one time. My uncle was preaching. Connie Adams is my uncle, by the way. And he was preaching some of his early lessons, and he was coming down on some immorality. And one of the brothers in this church stood up and pointed to the guy behind him and said, brother, he's talking about you. Well, I tell you what, that old boy got called out right in the service. And guess who came forward during the invitation? Yeah, he was talking about you. The lessons we preach are not intended to go over our head. They're intended to go in our heart. And we have to ask the question, Lord, is it I? Am I that person? Well, David was such a person. What he was doing is he was trying to serve God, or at least feigning that, but he was dragging his sin with him, and with that came the guilt and the shame of what he had done that he didn't want to own up to. We sometimes worry about what people think about us. Another depressed Bible character is the man Job. And we learn about his causes of depression, where he goes deep into despair. And in the book of Job, the entire book, he is just bombarded with issues. And he's troubled. He doesn't understand what's going on. I don't know that Job ever knew what was going on. Nothing in the book indicates that. But what he did know is that his Redeemer lived. What he did know is, though he slay me, yet will I serve him. And Job's faith carries him through when he doesn't understand what's going on, or as many today would say, Lord, why is this happening to me? Why me? And in Job's case, the answer is, or the question is, why not you? Who's better able to deal with some things in life than the person with a strong faith? Who is better able to demonstrate what a Christian does when there are trials that come our way? Back in 1997, I was at the doctor's office a year after I should have been diagnosed, and I was told I had stage 4 cancer. And I asked, is this the end? And the doc says, I can't predict that, I don't know. And what I had to do is to take a real long look at this thing, that I could ask the question, why me? Lord, I'm trying to serve you. I've gone through some tough times, and I've come out on this end of it. And why me, Lord? And the answer always is a question. Why not you? And so what I determined to do with that is to give my cancer to God for his glory. And I came through that. That has served me well, and I've had several people that have told me the things I'm going through, I learned how to do it from you. The path you're walking, the path we walk, we show people this is what a child of God does. Here's how we handle these problems. And we have plenty. But we walk by faith, don't we? And not by sight. Yes, Job was a man who was depressed. We look at others, and we spend the rest of our time on this, but we need to move on. But we look at others like King Saul. He had a troubled spirit that came from the Lord. Some depression does come from the Lord. His spirit was troubled, and I learned something about a thing that will help us during depression or depressed times. And for this cause, Saul sent for David because his music soothes my soul. Now, I'm very aware of guided imagery. I'm also very aware that I preached about this yesterday. Let's just take care of that. Be sure your sins will find you out. All right. Well, King Saul. His music soothes my soul. I'm aware with guided imagery and deep muscle relaxation that doctor's office music is not there just to put you to sleep before you go see the doctor. The high alpha notes release serotonin in the brain. And that serotonin is your relaxation drug. You make it right in your own brain. His music soothes my soul. It's right there. And I tell you what I learned about harp music, and I played a lot of that stuff during my cancer days. And what I realized is there's a soothing thing. And then I got to thinking, I don't know how to play a harp. If I'm going to be in heaven and we got harps, I better learn how to play one. I never did yet. But that soft music can soothe our soul. We can look at these other people, and each of them showed signs of depression. I'll leave that for you to deal with on your own. Jesus would be another one that I would look at as to, did he show signs of depression? I'm not saying that Jesus needed to go see a psychiatrist. But what I am saying is that he was a person of like passions like we are. And I read in John 13, verse 21 through 28, that the text says he was troubled in his spirit. That would indicate that he was not just flatline. Other things, such as Matthew 26:38, says he was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That tells me that we've got a depressed mood. Sorrow to the point of death. Being troubled. And Luke 22 says he was in agony, troubled, and in agony with sweat like drops of blood. That would indicate extreme anxiety and perhaps depression over what he was about to go through. Jesus was tempted in all points like we are, yet he did not sin. Well, what is depression? Now, in this, I'm going to be talking not about Jesus, but I'm going to be talking about other folks like us. We're not Jesus. There you go. All right. By the way, I get a number of phone calls. My clients don't know I'm in a meeting this week. All right. But what is depression? I want to talk about how this affects us. This is not just about being sad. We all have periods of time that we're sad. Depression is different from normal sadness because it tends to engulf the person's life day by day, interferes with their ability to work. They're kind of sidetracked. It's like their mind's not focused on what they need to be focused on. Usually it's accompanied by feelings of helplessness and hopelessness and worthlessness. I can't do anything right. I'm just messing up. Which sounds like the pity pot. Loss of interest in daily activities. Appetite changes. We either overeat or undereat or don't eat at all. Sleep changes. We can't sleep. We wake up with a startle. Anger, irritability, just not ourselves. Loss of energy, kind of self-loathing, kind of feeling sorry for ourselves, self-pity. Reckless behavior, such as endangering ourselves, and problems concentrating, just staying focused, and very non-productive. And then when it gets into the somatic kinds of problems, that depression doesn't go away, but it can take the form of physical things. I'm not a medical doctor, but a number of the medical things people experience, when we lift the depression, those medical symptoms start going away. How interesting. Because what we've done is we've swallowed that anger and that depression so deeply that it comes out in physical things. All right, I'm going to leave all of this, and then I'm going to talk about depression in teens. In teenagers, usually what we will see is a decline in the school grades. We'll see them withdrawing from friends and from their usual activities, acting out in anger or rage, sometimes taking that out on themselves. Anger turned inward is depression. And when anger turns inward, we'll get things like cutting. You're aware that some teens bloodlet, they cut, and other risky kinds of behavior. And sometimes what we see is teenagers that don't see any future. They don't plan to live very long. No future. Suicidal thoughts, poor self-esteem, a lot of guilt, and then along with that comes sometimes self-medication. All right, I don't have time to go into all of these. Not all depression is the same. Actually, when I was in one place and everybody came out, well, 2/3 of them that came out told me that they've been diagnosed with depression. And I asked them, well, what kind of depression do you have? And they just gave me this blank look. I said, you do know there's 9 kinds of depression. Now, most of the time when people are diagnosed with depression, they're talking about major depression, such as what I just talked about. But by and large, most of our brethren don't suffer from major depression. Some do. But they suffer from dysthymia. Dysthymia is a low-grade depression. It's kind of like there's no joy in Mudville. We can go through the motions, but life is routine, it's boring. We can do what we need to do, but there's no joy in it. That's dysthymia. That's my version of dysthymia. Postpartum depression obviously is about someone who's delivered a child. Seasonal affective disorder. We're seeing that right now as the days get shorter and we have less sunlight and people's vitamin D3 starts depleting and is not replenished, and people get depressed because it's dark. As a matter of fact, up in Alaska, during the dark days, they have a lot of that stuff. Okay, seasonal affective disorder. Atypical depression is depression that doesn't look like depression. This is the person that is the funny little clown that's laughing on the outside, but inside they're dying, or maybe already dead. It's the person that puts on the show. And so don't think that all depression means that your chin's dragging the ground. Sometimes depression is those that act extreme on the other end. That could also indicate bipolar. But there's bipolar depression, which is manic depression. And then this other one that is called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And what that is PMS times 10. That is very rare, but it does occur. And it's usually not diagnosed. And then there's situational depression. Somebody's died or we're dealing with some life issue, and that has us in a depressed mood. Those usually don't last a long time. We get past the situation. When I worked a suicide hotline, one of the trainings that we did was we encouraged the callers to try to keep the person on the phone for at least 20 minutes. That was a magic number. And here's what we know, is that the human mind is incapable of maintaining really intense thoughts for more than 20 minutes. And so we would talk with them about, well, if you're gonna kill yourself, let me find out something about you. Can you share some things? And so we'd talk about their dog and about their life and all that in 20 minutes. And often what we did is try to get them help during that time. But in 20 minutes, it's like, how are you doing now? Well, I think I'm going to be all right. That's far different than it was 20 minutes earlier. Well, situational depression. All right. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of this for our time. Here's some things people can do for depression. Develop a worry log. So when you're worried, have you a little book, a notebook of some sort, and write down what you're worried about. Keep a log in that, and what you'll see is those things tend to cluster, and then you can do something about that. If you're in therapy, you can take that and share it with your therapist or with whoever your confidant is, your accountability person. So create an anxiety and worry log, and be sure to put down what day of the week it is, what time of the day it is, and what you will start seeing is patterns and trends as to when your moods are going up and down. And then when we know that, now we can do some instead ofs during those time frames. Part of what we have to do also is to accept that life is uncertain. There's no guarantee that we're going to be flatline people. Fact is, life has its roller coaster moments. Take care of ourselves. Practice relaxation techniques. That is, have the time to kind of sit and chill. That quiet time. Jesus withdrew into a mountain alone to pray. Times for refreshing. I ask people a lot of times, what do you do for fun that's just for you? And many times I get a pause. People don't answer. Well, I don't do much for myself. Well, you need to start doing something for yourself. And then we start examining some things that they could do. Regular exercise certainly helps with that. As a matter of fact, with depression, what we find that can be as effective with some types of depression is exercise. As a matter of fact, when we compare exercise with an antidepressant, sometimes the exercise comes out more effective than the antidepressant. And by the way, many doctors will not tell you this, but antidepressants can work maybe good at the beginning, but over time they end up with a placebo effect. In other words, they're not being effective for your depression, but you might be hooked on them by then, keep going back to the doctor, get your script renewed, but it may not be doing its job. So I'm not saying stop your meds, I'm simply saying be aware of that. Well, all right. Suicide. We have this happens in some of our congregations. People either attempt to take their life, so there's risky behavior. Suicidal depression is not always something that happens when a person is down in the dumps. Sometimes a person will be down in the dumps and all of a sudden they're happy and cheerful again. And by the way, that could be a sign that something's wrong, that they've made a decision and now their mind's relieved. All they got to do is carry out that decision. So don't let a sudden shift, don't let that be something that you think, oh, they're better now. They may not be. All right. Self-mutilation, we talked about that. If a person has a history of suicide attempts, chances are that they will attempt again and again and again until they finally get it. The periods when there's significant losses, or if there are drugs or alcohol used, then that exacerbates the opportunity for suicide. As a matter of fact, most 60% of the suicides, 60-something%, happen along in conjunction with drugs and alcohol. So if a person has a problem with their medications or with drugs, alcohol, prescribed or street, then you need to be aware that they are more at risk than the average person. Okay. In 12 minutes, we're going to cover anxiety. All right, let me shift. There's a link between depression and anxiety. And by the way, I haven't even touched the hem of the garment on this subject. But anxiety and depression often travel together. And there is some indication that there is a biological component to these. In other words, and those travel along with temperament and so forth. But biologically, if we're from a family that has high anxiety or a lot of depression in the family history, then the body chemistry might kind of give them a propensity toward having the same thing. So there's a biology to some of this. Not all anxiety is sinful. Anxiety is really a natural response of our sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is, you've heard of fight and flight. Well, there's a third one, and it's called freeze. These are all primal responses. This is how people respond under pressure. And freeze is the more common one. Fight or flight means you either fight or you cower down in the corner and take whatever beating's coming to you. But the freeze is the deer in the headlight. I don't know what to do. Guess what? You stand in the middle of the road when something's coming and just stare, you're going to get run over. And that's what happens with a lot of people with this sympathetic nervous system when it kicks in. And that's a very common response to stress. I don't know what to do. You hear people say, I feel like pulling my hair out. And maybe some have. Okay, some anxiety and worry is normal. But we can go to extremes on this. There are several types of anxiety. Not all anxiety is the same. There is some that takes place in the midbrain and some that takes place in your frontal cortex. That which takes place in the midbrain is anxiety that generally is chemistry related. What's happening in the front part of our brain is that's responses to things going on around us. And it depends on which person's experiencing as to how that gets addressed. But things like separation anxiety. We were talking at supper, going down to college, in the first year down here in college, we're away from home, away from mommy, and away from the home environment, and I'm homesick. That's separation anxiety. Selective mutism is the person just doesn't talk. They shut down. Generalized anxiety disorder is the more common, and also social anxieties, afraid of social situations. That, by the way, is the reason some folks don't come, or at least they say why they don't come to worship services, or they come and they kind of sit off from somebody, from everybody. But social anxiety, that kind of anxiety also develops a paranoia about public speaking, about basically being obvious in a crowd. In other words, they want to blend with the crowd. There are phobias also. Phobia is unreasonable fears. And then obsessive compulsive disorders, those are part of anxiety. And obsessive compulsive disorders, by the way, we train people to be obsessive compulsive. And in schools, what we do is if you are thorough, we give you good grades. I asked one of my psych teachers, it's like, what's the difference between OCD and being thorough? And Joe tried to give an answer to that. And I asked him, it's like, okay, you reward us for being thorough, but yet you call us OCD to kid us. So which is it? I'm still waiting for the answer. But post-traumatic stress syndrome is people that have had traumatic things happen to them. We see this a lot with people during wartime. We also see it with people who have been raped or who have been in a sudden accident of some sort. Those who have witnessed untoward events and things like a bank robbery. Some things that are that startle kind of thing, and it's flashbulb stuff that can create the PTSD. And in the dark, close your eyes and you kind of relive that. Some people relive that. The 4th of July is a horrible time for some veterans because they're hearing all the fireworks, or they look up in the sky and here's the sparks in the sky, and it takes them back, almost transcends time to go back to where they were. Well, that's post-traumatic stress syndrome. There are ways to treat that and ways to deal with that. I'm not going to go into those this evening for sake of time. Hoarding also is another type of post-traumatic stress or of anxiety disorder. And then body dysmorphic disorder is also another indicator for, or another type of anxiety. And what that means is I'm not satisfied with the way my body looks. One young lady I talked to, and I thought she was pretty decent looking young lady. Actually, she was kind of beautiful. And she said, I don't like the way I look. It's like, well, what's wrong with the way you look? And she said, I have one nostril that's bigger than the other. It's like, well, I didn't notice that. But now I'll be looking at your nostrils. I didn't say that. But, yeah. But do you know anybody that's really satisfied with the way they look? Look in the mirror, it's like, well, one ear is lower than the other. One ear pokes out more than the other. Or, you know, I got this pimple on my face, and everybody's going to be looking at that pimple. Folks, people have better things to do than to look at our pimples. People have better things to do than to look. And if they got nothing better to do than to see one ear's higher than the other, let them look. There's some things we can't change. And that's about accepting who we are, what we look like. We're all different. And it's about being comfortable in our own skin. trichotillomania. I think I said that right. That's when people want to pull their hair out. I know I won't say anything. But I have one particular client that she has had plenty of hair, but she sat and just pulled it out right by the roots. She didn't have hair anymore. And she did that because of her anxiety. She also did it because it caused her to be able to feel. And she said, I just feel so numb that at least when I do that, I feel something. Well, that's a type of a stress disorder for sure, and part of anxiety. Now, let me look at this. I did a wonderful lesson outline using these three passages, and I was going to get up and preach this and tell brethren, it's a sin to be anxious. And we looked at these verses, and here's what they say. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life, what you eat or drink, or your body, what you'll put on, that life is more than food and the body than raiment. And what he says is don't be anxious. Don't be worried about your life. I looked at that, and it's like, okay, got that. That's a good verse on this. Tell everybody this is wrong. And then I looked at 1 Peter 5:7. Cast your anxiety on him, for he cares for you. Like, well, there's another one. I can use that one too. And then I went to Philippians chapter 4, and there, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. If you'll notice in that, there's a promise that's there in verse 7 about the peace of God. Now, those three verses seem like they were just great verses to tell all the brethren, if you're anxious, you're sinning. And I asked myself the question, after I'd done that, put that together, it's like, did Jesus ever have anxious moments? Did Paul ever have anxious moments? And you know what I did? I took that sermon and wadded it up through the trash can, because it was only partial truth. And then I talked about those three verses in the lesson, but also talked about these verses. The Apostle Paul, Epaphroditus, Paul talked about how on him daily was the anxiety for all the churches. Like, what was Paul sinning? He was out here anxious for all the churches. Was he sinning? In 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8 through 10, we are afflicted, look at that, afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. And now I got to look at that, afflicted, persecuted, struck down, carrying in your body the marks of Jesus, who've been beaten. Are those indicators? It's like, I think so. And then he adds that on him daily is the anxiety for all the churches. And then I went to 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5. For even when we were in Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side, conflicts without, fears within. Does that say anything about anxiety? Now here's an apostle that is talking about that he had troubles. He was troubled about things that were going on in the church and in his ministry. When he is led over the wall in a basket, do you suppose that maybe he was a little anxious about that moment? And I looked at that and it's like, you know what? I don't think I can preach that it's a sin to be anxious. I think that I could preach it's a sin not to do the right thing with our anxiety. And that's how I shifted. What do you do with it? We have it. There are moments that make us anxious. I go back to that 20-second thing or 20-minute thing. Everything will look different in 20 minutes. I use that very often when I tend to be stressed about nothing that's really important. But in the moment, it feels important. And I tell myself, Art, everything's going to look different in 20 minutes. Just hold on. The scene will change. And you know it does. It all looks different in 20 minutes. Maybe in the midst of a conflict that happened today. I was trying to get the company to come shampoo my carpet, and the guy didn't like the way I asked because I didn't know how many rooms are in my house. And the reason I don't is because he was talking about how many wall partitions do you have in your house, and I've got some open concept areas. And I didn't know the answer to the question, but he insisted on a number. And finally he got frustrated and said, well, we're just not going to do business with you. We're going to take you off our list. And that upset me. I won't go into it any further except they're coming out Friday. But I had to tell myself, just hold on, don't get mad, don't get anxious about it. In 20 minutes, it'll look different. And it did. I got a call from his supervisor because I asked to speak to the supervisor. And I even got a free room thrown in. Well, at any rate, fear is within. But there are anxious moments, whether it's that or whether it's something else. We have things that create fear for us. And fear is a natural part of life. As a matter of fact, if you don't have fear, you're probably not going to survive long. Because that's what fight, flight, freeze is about. There's some things we need to run from, and some things we need to stand our ground on. And sometimes we just need to stand still. And I believe that's what Isaiah said when he said, wait on the Lord. Don't get ahead of him. Don't get behind him. Wait on the Lord. Don't step out and fight the Lord's battle for him. Be patient. That's otherwise known as walking by faith. Now there's another operative that comes in here, and that is, do we trust God? Do you trust him? Do you believe that God has your best interest in mind? That whatever comes, high, low, whatever, God's got it. The Caesars couldn't understand how Christians would be willing to give up their life for their cause. But what they knew is that whatever it was, the Roman Empire needed that. And so those persecutions of the 2nd and 3rd centuries came to an end as there was an attempt to harness the power of Christianity for the good of the Roman Empire. When people see us go through situations and everybody's anxious and fidgety and all that, and they're getting all spun up, and we Christians have a calmness about us because we know how it's going to end. God's got this. There's nothing that is worth us giving our life up for except Jesus. There's no reason to have a coronary because something didn't happen my way. I don't have to win every fight. Fact is, there's a humility about losing some of those. I don't like to do that, but there's a humility about it. You see, sometimes we get so busy trying to have our way that we forget about letting God have his way. We pray for patience and God gives it to us, and then we get all anxious about it. What's wrong with that? I want it now. You're right, Julian. Now, Paul talked in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, and verse 28, apart from such external things, there's a daily pressure on me of concern or anxiety for all the churches. I had to ask the question in that lesson that I have my 3 key passages that are often quoted, but these are not usually included in that. And there is a concern for the churches. Your elders here and in other places, they have concern for the church. And I'm sure you brethren do too. When things go on, and sometimes we get people that kind of turn inside outwards, is the way my folks used to talk about it. They just get out here and create havoc in the church. I know, Kyle, for us as preachers, sometimes we just want to shake our head and, what are we going to do with this? And we lose sleep over it. And we talk to people about it. And we have to wait for solutions because answers are not always immediate. What do you do during that time? That's where prayer, that's where time with our other brethren, talking about what are the options and the opportunities here. And sometimes the answer is we need to wait on the Lord, that sins find people out. And sometimes we find out about something before we have all the detail enough to make the determination. And we have to trust the Lord. Well, daily pressures Paul talked about. Now in Philippians, he talked about, but I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, because he was longing for you all and was distressed because he had heard, you had heard that he was sick. He was distressed. That's a word that has to do with anxiety. All right, now we can look at some other verses, and I'm moving on now. Okay. By the way, let me go on this one. There are some things that cause depression and anxiety. And among those are daily difficulties, but also family concerns. And I haven't said a lot about parenting, and probably won't have much time to talk about that this weekend, or whatever this is. But come back this weekend. In 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 5, David was concerned about his family. How many of us have not been distressed about our family? How many of us, in terms of parenting, have prayed to God to help me deal with my young person, with their phones, with their devices? Help me to know what to do, Father, and help me to use the resources in a congregation available to me. We're not the only parents here. And maybe we can learn from what others are doing. I tell you what will really upset people that are using things wrong is when we get together as a team and we kind of figure it out. Don't be the weak link. Family concerns. Those cause us to be very, very sidetracked. Ungodly living does too. David talked about his anxiety. For I confess my sin, and I am full of anxiety because of my sin. Now I want to just ask this question. What causes you to be anxious? Are our sins catching up with us? Do we need to confess and forsake those sins? And if you have sins, that's the answer. That's yes. Let us not be worried and overly alarmed about these things. You're aware that these PowerPoints are yours. The symptoms of this, panic attacks. We see this very much in the church. By the way, virtually every person, over 90% of people, at some point in their life had a panic attack. Now, panic attack usually comes out of, feels like nowhere. It's where you feel like you leave your body and you're out here and your body's here. You feel like elephants sitting on your chest. You wonder if you're having a heart attack, and you're not. Prickly skin, clammy. Those are signs of panic attack as well as others. What do you do during that? Panic attacks don't last more than 15 minutes. But I tell you what, during that 15 minutes, that's not fun. Well, what do we do when we've got all this stuff going on? Maybe hyperventilating, stomach cramps. So what do we do during this? What we do is we take some deep breaths, breathe. You ever look at a frog? You ever notice a frog? You hold this frog up and he's got this belly that just kind of pooches out. Now, have you ever looked at a newborn babe? You hold that newborn babe up and their belly's just like that frog? And somewhere along the way, someone told us, suck your gut in, you look fat. So we walk around sucking our gut in, walk around with tight stomachs so that we can really look like we're not the size we are. And you know what that does? That sends a signal to our body that there's a reason to get ready to fight. Because when you get ready to fight, what do? You tighten your muscles up and you control your vital organs. And tightening that stomach's part of that, getting ready for the punch. Now, if we walk around like that, don't be surprised if you have a problem with anxiety. Sometimes we just need to chill. Exercise. Okay. Here's some questions, and this is final. The question is, do you make time for yourself each day? And I should add that, do you make time for God and yourself each day? Do you get emotional support that you need? Or are we just kind of reliant totally on ourselves? Do we take care of our body, which is the temple of the Lord? Get your proper rest. Get your proper nutrition. You go to the doctor, and some of the first things the doctor tell you is that you need to watch your diet, you need to lose some weight, you need to get some exercise. They don't say that just so they can collect their fee. They say that because they know there's something to that. And that's what we're saying here. If we are overloaded with responsibility, what do? Simple down. God did not intend for us to do everything in the world there is to do. Simple down. Pick the things that are important and not just try to do everything. You know, when you try to do everything, sometimes you don't do anything well. Ask for help when you need it. Don't take it all on yourself. Live a balanced life. Sometimes we need professional help. How can you help other people? Listen to them. Pray to God for them. Help them maybe to confess their sins, to release the burden that's there in their soul. And then encourage people to do things that are productive. One of my big complaints about some of the recovery groups are you sit around in those groups talking about the things that you shouldn't be talking about. I'm going to come in here and talk about not drinking and go out and think, the whole time I was talking about not drinking, what was I thinking about? I was thinking about drinking. Sometimes you need to change the channel. And what I found in talking with people is that sometimes the best way to talk about the problem is not to talk about the problem. Let's talk about other things. Let's get a little break from that. I tell people what we ought to do is to put those problems in our mind in a banker's box, put it on a shelf, and I can come back and take that down when I want to. In the meantime, let me look at the other things I need to do. Being a parent, being a faithful co-worker, being a leader in the church or whatever the deal is. And let's think about those things, and then we can come back and talk about this, but we don't have to dwell on that all the time. Dwelling on it all the time will make you sick. Well, as you can see, there's way more on these in this lesson than we have time for tonight. But I want to encourage you to take an inventory of yourself. Do you have depression going on in your life? If so, what are you doing about it? There are things that you can do, and we've talked about some of those now. Are you anxious? Cast your cares upon him who cares for you. Talk to people that can help you walk through that and help you find the answers that are already inside yourself. But by all means, don't stuff this stuff down inside, because it doesn't go away by itself. It will cause other things to happen in your life. So what do we do with our problems? What do we do with our moods? We address them, and we finish the business that they have introduced to our life, and we get help to do that. Let us remember that we are our brother's keeper, and let us share in the fellowship of Christianity by sharing our lives and bearing one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I've talked an awful long time tonight, but I want to encourage you to listen patiently as you've listened patiently, and to apply these things in your life, and to ask the question, Lord, is it I? We can help you in some way to respond to the message, or to unburden your soul in some way. Confessing our faults one to another is what the Lord tells us to do in James 5:16. He also tells us that the best way to start out is with a full surrender, by giving our life to Jesus and being buried in the waters of baptism, so that our sins can be taken away. And then you've got help, a present help in every kind of trouble that you can ever face. The Lord is that kind of a being. And he's asked us to help him in that process. Will you let us do that? Why don't you come while we stand and sing?